On the night of March 22, 1990, a Canadian engineer named Gerald Bull walked toward the door of his Brussels apartment and was shot 5 times, twice in the back of the head, by someone who left no fingerprints, no witness, and no note. Belgian police never charged anyone. No security service ever employed him. He designed guns, one gun in particular, built years earlier for a country that no member of the United Nations was legally allowed to sell so much as a rifle cartridge to. That gun still holds a range record most artillery pieces built since have never matched. To understand why an engineer ends up dead outside his own front door over a howitzer sold to a country under total embargo, you have to go back further than the gun, back to a massacre, a walkout from the Commonwealth, and a state company built specifically so that nobody could ever quite prove where its weapons came from. That company was called Armscor. What it built did not stop when the embargo ended, and neither, it turns out, did the method. None of that machinery existed yet on the morning this story actually begins. March 21, 1960, a township called Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg. Police opened fire on a crowd protesting the pass laws that controlled where black South Africans could live and work, and by the time the shooting stopped, 69 people were dead, many shot in the back as they ran. The African National Congress, which had spent decades pursuing nonviolent resistance, concluded within months that the door had closed and turned toward an armed struggle. The government drew a different lesson from the same morning. It decided it was no longer managing a policing problem. It was managing a war. And it began preparing accordingly. It took the world a few years to respond, and when it did, the response arrived from several directions in quick succession. In 1961, rather than face expulsion over apartheid, South Africa withdrew from the Commonwealth on its own terms. In 1963, the United Nations called on member states to voluntarily stop selling South Africa weapons. Voluntary meant unenforced, but it was also unmistakably a warning shot, and the government read it correctly. Before the ban could harden into something binding, it needed the machinery to build its own weapons, and it started assembling that machinery almost immediately. In 1964, an Armaments Act created a state board that absorbed the Defense Department's workshops, a state engineering plant, and the ammunition section of the South African Mint. That same year, a Belgian license brought the FNFAL battle rifle to Pretoria's assembly lines, and Italy licensed a jet trainer. Within a few years, nearly 1,000 private companies, foundries, chemical plants, and engineering shops that had never touched a weapon before had been pulled into arms production by a board that had not existed a decade earlier. In 1968, that board was reorganized under a new law into the Armaments Development and Production Corporation, Armscor. It absorbed an aircraft manufacturer built 3 years earlier to produce military planes and avionics, and it was given a power that mattered more than any single contract: the legal authority to fuse civilian and military manufacturing wherever it found spare capacity. A government assessment from 1970 noted, almost in passing, that small arms and ammunition were by then being produced not only at dedicated ordnance plants, but at the Mint and at a chemical company that had previously made nothing but civilian mining explosives. Armscor's ambitions ran well past building an arms industry. It was quietly redesigning the country's entire industrial base so it could become one on short notice, without asking anyone's permission first. For most of the 1960s and early 1970s, that permission had not been strictly necessary. France sold Mirage fighters modified to South African specifications. West Germany and Switzerland sold components. Italy kept training South African pilots. The dependency was real, but the doors were still, mostly, open. Then, in 1975, they started closing at the exact moment South Africa needed them most. South African forces crossed into Angola that year, in an operation meant to back anti-Marxist factions against a government that had just received direct Cuban military backing. And the mismatch showed up almost immediately. The armored cars Armscor had been assembling under French license held their own against Cuban tanks. The artillery did not. South African guns dated to the Second World War, and Soviet-built rocket systems in Cuban hands consistently outranged them, hitting South African positions from distances the older guns simply could not answer back. A gun that cannot reach the enemy stops being a disadvantage and becomes something closer to dead weight. and by early 1976 the South African military establishment understood exactly what it needed. An artillery piece that did not yet exist, purchased from a world that had spent the last decade telling it, with increasing seriousness, that it would sell it nothing at all. Artillery was the gap the generals could see. It would not be the only one Pretoria decided to close by whatever means necessary. In 1974, at a workshop outside Pretoria, engineers began sketching that new 155mm howitzer under the codename Project Boas, working from a Canadian design as their starting point. The path from that Canadian blueprint to a South African gun ran through one man, Gerald Bull, the same engineer who would be found dead in Brussels 16 years later. Bull had been, by every account, a prodigy. In the 1960s, he ran Canada's high-altitude research project, an attempt to fire scientific payloads into orbit from a modified naval gun instead of a rocket, until the Canadian government cut its funding in 1967, and the whole program collapsed around him. He did not walk away from artillery. He founded the Space Research Corporation and built its headquarters to straddle the border between Vermont and Quebec, a compound positioned deliberately so that its operations touched two governments and neither one had a full view of what crossed the property line. In 1977, Bull's company sold Armscor everything Project Boas needed: gun barrels, technical drawings, and 30,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition. None of it was shipped to South Africa directly. It moved through buyers registered in Antigua, then through a company in Spain, on paperwork that never once had to use the word South Africa. American investigators would later call it one of the largest sanctions evasion operations their government ever prosecuted. And the scale backs that up. 30,000 shells is a war reserve, not a sample shipment. 5 months later, on November 4, 1977, the United Nations Security Council did something it had never done before. It voted, unanimously, to make the embargo against South Africa binding international law. Not a suggestion any government could quietly ignore, but an obligation every member state was required to enforce. Bull's shipment had already reached Pretoria by then. Armscor had gotten the one material it needed most under the wire, months ahead of a law built specifically to stop exactly that kind of sale. Resolution 418 closed every future door. It could not reopen the one that had already swung shut behind 30,000 shells. Bull did not get away with it quietly. In 1980, American customs agents arrested him for violating the same embargo his shipment had beaten by 5 months. And he pleaded guilty rather than fight it, drawing 6 months in the Federal Correctional Complex at Allenwood, Pennsylvania. He later described the case as the price of doing business in a market nobody would admit existed. He was not wrong about the market. 2 years after his release, on March 28, 1982, Armscor's chairman stood in front of reporters and announced that South African engineers had taken Bull's design and finished it, a 155mm gun howitzer capable of hitting targets at least 50% farther than any comparable NATO or Soviet weapon in the field. The G5 entered service the following year, with a range that would not be seriously challenged by another towed howitzer for over a decade. The embargo had been built in part to prevent precisely this outcome. It had delayed it by roughly 2 years. By then, Armscor was no longer a wartime improvisation. It was an industrial empire that employed close to 160,000 people at its peak, across state subsidiaries and private contractors alike. And it ran that empire through more than 100 front companies. Nominally independent businesses scattered from South Africa to Switzerland to the Caribbean, whose only job was buying restricted technology without a trail leading back to Pretoria. It worked. By 1983, 6 years after Resolution 418 became binding law, South Africa had become the 10th largest arms exporter on Earth, selling to roughly 50 countries. Exports peaked around 1985 at close to $102 million in a single year, a figure that looks modest next to the American or Soviet arms trade, and looks almost impossible next to a country the entire United Nations had voted to cut off. Investigators could see pieces of the network constantly. Convicting it was the hard part. In March 1984, customs officers in Coventry intercepted a shipment of artillery elevating gears at Birmingham Airport. and traced it back to 4 South African nationals and 3 British collaborators who had spent months moving radar magnetrons, high-pressure gas cylinders, and aircraft parts to South Africa through exactly the kind of shell arrangement Bull had pioneered years earlier. A buyer on paper who was never the buyer, in fact. The case became known as the Coventry Four, and it made headlines, and it resulted in convictions. What it did not do was touch Armscor. You can arrest the man who signs for a shipment. You cannot as easily arrest a structure engineered, from its very first reorganization in the late 1960s, to survive the loss of any single piece. The same machine that hid howitzer shipments was, at the same time, hiding something far larger. In 1979, control of South Africa's nuclear weapons program was formally handed to Armscor, folding bomb design into the same corporate structure that was already building artillery and fighter jets under front company cover. A new facility, the Kentron Circle, went up 20 kilometers west of Pretoria in 1980s to house the work. Built with help from a covert relationship with Israel that had already supplied the airframe technology behind South Africa's rebuilt Cheetah fighters. On September 22, 1979, an American satellite recorded a double flash of light over the South Atlantic consistent with a nuclear detonation. Nobody in Washington ever officially confirmed what it was. Most of the specialists who have studied it since believe it was a joint South African and Israeli test. A country the United Nations had specifically voted to disarm was, at the same moment, finishing an actual nuclear arsenal, using a network built to move howitzer barrels. By 1987, Armscor had fielded the G6, a self-propelled version of the same gun that had made its name 5 years earlier, and its subsidiaries were turning out armored vehicles, rebuilt fighter jets, and finished nuclear weapons at the same time. An industrial base wildly out of proportion to the economy beneath it. Then the politics that had justified all of it started to give way. F.W. de Klerk became president in 1989. And in July 1990, under the same Armscor structure that had built them, South Africa quietly began taking its nuclear weapons apart. By September 1991, all 6 completed devices had been dismantled, and every gram of weapons-grade material had been accounted for and locked away. South Africa remains to this day the only country ever to build a nuclear arsenal and then give up every warhead voluntarily. Gerald Bull did not live to see any of it finished. By the late 1980s, he had moved on from South Africa to Iraq, where he was designing a long-range supergun for Saddam Hussein's government, a project publicly known as Babylon, theoretically capable of putting a shell, or something heavier, into orbit. On March 22, 1990, he walked toward his own front door in Brussels and did not make it inside. Senior Israeli intelligence officials have since claimed responsibility, though nobody was ever formally charged, for a killing that ended the career of the one engineer whose smuggled barrels had made Armscor's signature weapon possible in the first place. Days later, British customs officers at T-Sport docks confiscated barrel sections for Bull's Iraqi supergun disguised as petrochemical pressure vessels. And more turned up in transit through Spain and Switzerland, the same countries whose paperwork had once carried Armscor's shipments. The method he helped build in South Africa had not died with him. It had simply moved on to its next client, and it took its old passport with it. Every version of this story, artillery in 1977, warheads in 1979, a supergun disguised as pressure vessels in 1990, runs into the same unglamorous question. How does a mandatory unanimous embargo, enforced by the world's most capable navies and customs services, fail to stop this for over a decade? Western agencies were not careless. Britain convicted the Coventry Four. The United States imprisoned Gerald Bull. Both governments knew, in general terms, that Armscor was buying restricted technology throughout the 1980s. What almost no investigator could ever do was reach the institution itself. That gap had been engineered into Armscor from its earliest days. The nuclear file shows the same design working in miniature. When Armscor took over weapons development in 1979, it did not run the program under its own name. It handed the file to Kentron, a subsidiary that, on paper, looked like any other engineering contractor building the small airframes and components. Anyone auditing Kentron's contracts would have found circuit boards and metalwork. What they would not easily have found was a bomb program. An embargo assumes a target with a fixed, discoverable shape. A government department buying openly, through channels a customs officer can trace on a manifest. Armscor was built, from its earliest reorganization in the late 1960s, specifically so it would never have that shape. More than 100 front companies stood between an Armscor and every restricted purchase, each one a nominally independent business with its own bank accounts, its own paperwork, and its own management registered wherever the deal required. Antigua, Spain, Switzerland, Panama, the United Kingdom. Each one could be exposed, fined, raided, or shut down completely without the loss ever reaching the state entity standing behind it. South Africa was never embarrassed that it had an arms industry. Its own officials announced production milestones to reporters. What the country hid, deliberately and systematically, was the sourcing, the exact channel connecting a restricted seller to a South African end user. The G5 is the cleanest illustration of how that worked in practice. Its barrels never traveled in a straight line from Gerald Bull's company to a factory floor outside Pretoria. They went to a buyer in Antigua first, then to a buyer in Spain. Only after that did they reach Armscor, on a route with no single customs form anywhere connecting a ballistics company on the Vermont-Quebec border to the South African state. Investigators in London and Washington could convict the fronts, the men who signed the manifests, the shell companies that briefly held title to a shipment. They could almost never reach what stood behind them. Ask why a mandatory, unanimous, United Nations-backed embargo failed to meaningfully slow a country from becoming the world's 10th largest arms exporter within 6 years. And the honest answer has less to do with anyone dozing at the border than with the target itself, built on purpose without a fixed border investigators could ever fully watch. Apartheid ended. Armscor did not. The question in 1992 was which half of the old machine would survive the transition, the half that built the weapons, or the half that had always known how to move them without being seen. In 1992, its factories and more than 15,000 of its workers were split into a separate company, Denel, while Armscor kept the half of the job that mattered most for its survival, procurement, export licensing, and enforcement of South Africa's own arms control law, a role written permanently into law in 2003 and one it still performs today for the South African National Defence Force. Denel, left to run factories without the front company network behind it, did not do well alone. Through the 2010s, it slid into a real financial collapse, unable to reliably pay its own staff, kept alive by a series of government bailouts that included 3.4 billion rand in a single financial year, most of which went to old debts rather than new production. In April 2025, the government moved what remained of it directly under the Ministry of Defense, an admission that Denel could no longer be trusted to run itself. Armscor, the half of the company built to make its own paper trail disappear, did not fade the same way. In December 2022, a sanctioned Russian cargo ship called the Lady R docked quietly at Simonstown Naval Base. At night, its tracking transponders switched off, while residents nearby watched container trucks and cranes work under an armed guard for hours. The American ambassador to South Africa later told local media he would, in his words, bet his life on the accuracy of the claim that weapons and ammunition had been loaded onto that ship. The South African government commissioned a panel to investigate, and the panel eventually concluded, in a report the government has never released in full, that the Lady R had actually come to deliver equipment for the National Defense Force. Equipment Armscor itself had ordered from Russia back in 2018. No export permit for Russian arms turned up in the country's own conventional arms control records. Nobody was ever charged with anything. Nobody was ever charged. Gerald Bull's murder in 1990 is still officially an unsolved crime. The Lady R investigation in 2022 wrapped up before it had really started asking hard questions. 32 years apart, under two different flags, the same institution sits in the middle of both stories, built more than 50 years ago for one specific purpose: to move weapons the world had voted against moving, and to make absolutely certain that whoever came asking questions afterward would find a paper trail that stopped exactly where they needed it to continue. The G5 does not turn heads anymore. The 50% range advantage that made headlines on March 28, 1982, was matched and then beaten within a decade by other guns, some of them built by engineers who learned the trade from Armscor's own program. What has outlasted the gun is the method, a front standing between buyer and seller, an institution that survives every prosecution of the shadow it casts. If that closing detail landed for you, the way an unsolved death from 1990 and an unexplained shipment from 2022 turned out to be the same story, put the word paperwork in the comments, so I know you made it to the end. For more on the companies, engineers, and states built to survive the rules meant to stop them, subscribe. See you in the next one.